for our Center for the Advancement of Teaching Excellence at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I've been doing that for about 3 years now. I actually came to Chicago from Los Angeles, moved here in the middle of the pandemic, which was an experience in and of itself for another day. But I came from UCLA, where I actually spent about 22 years of my life. And I did my PhD in STEM, in the biological sciences there. And I stuck around for 15 years, I guess it was, in which I really immersed myself in teaching. I taught microbiology, genomics, microbial ecology for a long time, a lot of laboratory courses, big first year direct admit biology courses, capstone courses for seniors, and just sort of had a breadth of experiences. Even at the graduate level, was teaching some courses at the graduate level when I left. So I transitioned from teaching there to a more of an administrative role and founded our STEM Center for Teaching and Learning there, and was really helping to facilitate professional development for our faculty across the life sciences and eventually the physical sciences as well, chemistry, math, physics, just really trying to support an environment in which we were doing more and attending to, I think, inclusivity and equity in the classroom more so than we ever had really done so previously. And so that's where a lot of my work now focuses in professional development, and Par invited me here today to do a workshop with you all, kind of an intro, if you will, to the inclusive teaching framework that I use in the work that I do. And just to kind of keep us focused, this is a workshop that's really designed around the syllabus and to give you some ideas in which to include things and kind of think about things in your syllabus, but with the idea that this, does translate to practices in the classroom. And there are things that certainly go well beyond the syllabus, but this is always kind of a nice place to start and get us all thinking about what we can do, some of the low-hanging fruit changes and things that we might think about from the first day, from the get-go with our students. So let's see. I do, as Par pointed out, want to acknowledge, some of us are at home, some of us are in the office. I am actually at home myself, and as life happens around us, pets, children, roommates, who knows, I see many of you have your screens off and things, but just to let you know, you're invited to turn on your video, but, sort of acknowledging we have a lot of things going on around us. So you're by no means required. But if you do have a question during the workshop, please use the chat. I'm sure Par, if I can ask you to help me monitor the chat as we go along. I think I have to open it again. When you start sharing your screen, it disappears. There we go. I've just opened it. But please ask questions or use the emoji, the icons and things to raise your hand. And I think Par, again, if you can just help me keep an eye on that would be really wonderful. So, okay. All right, so what are we doing today? So I just want to really kind of kick us off in many of the ways, reflecting the way, I teach and letting you know exactly where we're going in the roadmap here with our learning objectives for the workshop. So what I'm hoping we'll accomplish is really identifying some components of inclusive teaching that we use to inform syllabus development, and specifically focusing on some of the language and design elements that you can think about in your syllabus. We will spend a little bit of time reflecting on some of the content maybe that you're including in your syllabus and thinking about what voices are represented there, and maybe how to frame the subject matter that you're teaching in ways that at least give voice or attention to some of the groups and things that have been historically underrepresented in STEM. And really, I think they're just making efforts, or at least to think about ways in which to better connect the material, the content that we're teaching to the lived experiences of our students. Because of course that helps them stay motivated, interested, engaged, and persist in the subject matter that we're teaching. And just to kind of close out, because this is oftentimes a question that I'm asked when it comes to any syllabus for that matter, what sorts of things can I do now that you've told me all of these things I should be including in my syllabus? This is potentially getting longer and longer. How am I going to get my students to read the syllabus? So we'll give you some tricks and tips on that as well. All right, so just a quick poll. I'm just wondering if you could all just give me a hint here of how often do you revise your syllabus? And if you could just use the chat for your responses, A, B, C, or D here. A, I make small revisions to my syllabus each time I teach a course. B, I make large revisions to my syllabus each time I teach a course. C, I completely remake the syllabus every time I teach a course. And D, I very rarely make changes to my syllabus. Lots of A's, lots of A's. So small changes every time you teach. Okay, all right. Good to know. That's where we're all kind of starting. And this is a, kind of pretty common. We don't often think about this. We kind of put a lot of effort into designing a syllabus the first time we teach, and then we hope we can kind of modestly modify it each time and focus potentially on other elements of the course. All right, so hoping today with some of the exercises that we're going to go through is, I hope that you'll see that some of the changes you might be able to think about to your syllabus may not be large revisions, if you will, that they will be more aligned with this idea of making some smaller revisions, some small things that you can do to really make your syllabus more inclusive for your students. All right. So I don't know if any of you have used this tool before, Jamboard, but I want to do, I see Scarlett, you're nodding. So I will put the link to this Jamboard in the chat for everybody. Oops, if I can spell it right. So if you could click on that link and navigate to the Jamboard itself, it should look like this. And what I'm hoping you can do is just take a moment to think about and reflect onto yourself this very straightforward question. What is the purpose of a syllabus? And in your responses, if you haven't used this before, if you click over here on this icon that looks like a little page here, this will bring up a sticky note. And so you can type in your answer. In the sticky note, you can change colors. And then if you press save and click back here, you'll see the sticky note appear. You can move it around. You can increase or decrease the size. And so then we can kind of group these and move these around accordingly. So I will delete that. And I'm going to be quiet here for just a moment to give you a chance to reflect and add your responses. This is great. So a lot of consistency here. We're seeing really informing students like what the expectations of the class are, how they are going to succeed in your class, where they might access help and resources to be successful, giving some guidelines on the goals of the class, the learning objectives, sort of the structure in the order of material that they're going to encounter, important dates to be aware of so they can plan ahead. I saw something on here, planning. Information like the textbook and course policies, introducing yourself to students, right? And not just the material, but also to who's delivering this material to them, why you care, who you are. Lots of resources, requirements. I see the word rules, contract between you and the students, setting the tone for class. So lots of different ideas about, the purpose of, and where we kind of all come into this work with respect to the syllabus. Okay, let's get back to the presentation. Got this Zoom bar in the middle of my screen here. Okay, all right. So, oops, what do we got here? Somebody annotate. I think somebody annotated the slide. We'll go back and delete that. There we go. Okay. So I just want to share a little bit, about some of the ideas and things from the literature, and kind of setting us up for the things that we're going to talk about today, specifically during the workshop. And so these are a number of things, and some of these things overlap with what you had shared. The syllabus is really an opportunity to welcome students to your course, provide that essential information about the course, really be clear about the students' responsibilities, how they're going to be evaluated, the schedule, the timeline, the resource for students where they can find help. It's an opportunity to provide the broader context for their learning, how it's relevant to either other coursework in the curriculum, in their major field of study, and just really kind of within their world and how that material relates to their everyday life or their career aspirations. And as someone said, setting the tone for your classroom. And we're going to talk concretely about what some of these things mean. So I just wanted to share, there was a research study that was done not too long ago that really looked at the way in which you could use the syllabus as a tool to really encourage students' help-seeking behavior. And so I want to kind of pause here and say, some of you had pointed out that the syllabus you can provide resources to students. You can share where they can find those resources, but just because you share does not necessarily mean that they will utilize those resources, right? And so how, and that was what these researchers were looking at, how can we really make create an intentional way to encourage this behavior? So they looked at this and were really trying to examine how can the syllabus be a tool beyond just a contract for students to know the expectations. And so what they did was they looked at tone specifically. Tone and the presence of a specific statement that addressed, in this case, mental health, and whether or not tone and having an explicit statement in the syllabus would increase students' intentions to approach instructors or other resources on campus for help. And so they had examples of what we would call a warm tone syllabus. And so just to be concrete about what they meant by this, it included positive and friendly language, a rationale for assignments, it used humor, it conveyed compassion. There were personal experiences. One of you mentioned introducing yourself to the students through your syllabus, really showing explicit enthusiasm about the material and its relevance to the world. when I am talking about this statement, this reach out statement. So really being clear and saying, you know, students encounter setbacks from time to time. If you encounter difficulties or need assistance, it's important to reach out, consider discussing the situation with me or with an advisor, and then learn about the resources that we have with a list of the resources provided there. So when they looked at the results of this, and they applied basically, you know, just kind of a rubric to the syllabus to make sure that these things were included. But then they looked at the difference basically between whether or not the syllabus statement was present or absent, and whether or not the tone was warm or cold. And so here, and just to try to make this table a little bit easier to interpret, where they saw tone had a significant effect. I've sort of outlined these in blue here, is where there were areas of the syllabus encouraging students to get help with a class assignment, if the students were feeling low, in addressing campus resources. And you can see here whether or not the syllabus, that statement was present, that the overall report from students in terms of the Likert scale that we're using was higher with a warm versus a cold tone. Here you see the same, a warm tone syllabus versus a colder tone syllabus. And when you look at specifically whether or not that statement had an effect, this was more relevant to issues around sort of personal issues that were happening in the students' lives, in which they saw a higher effect with the warm tone syllabus as well. So, you know, we're going to come back to this in what I mean by, you know, how do we make a warm tone syllabus? What are we talking about in terms of some of these statements? And I'm going to give you some examples of this. But I kind of wanted to go through and outline, you know, there's so many components of a syllabus that we're trying to, you know, convey information to students. And we aren't going to have time during this workshop to go through every single section, every component of the syllabus, but I am going to highlight some examples because I think sometimes where we don't even think about opportunity to sort of address this, we can do this throughout our syllabus, depending on, you know, sort of regardless of what section and things it might fall in. So one of the resources I want to share with you is a quick guide, and I'll put a link to this in the chat. So this is a quick guide to an inclusive syllabus. And so I'll just say this now, especially if folks end up needing to leave the workshop early or anything like that. I did want to make sure that I kind of provided this resource from the get-go, because this is essentially like a rubric that you could apply to your own syllabus, looking at various sections and giving you some ideas for specific strategies you could use to basically warm up and create a more welcoming tone to your syllabus. And really thinking about the learning objectives, the language that's selected, how you're conveying contact information to students, what you're including in the course description, the required materials, and thinking about you know, open educational resources and other ways in which to make materials and educational technology accessible to students, ways in which to think about communicating expectations and classroom norms, using community guidelines or you know, standards of practice that the students essentially adhere to, you know, in lieu of sort of a more classroom management rules approach. Assessment of learning, what you might think about there, course schedule, how that might be laid out, some of the ways you could, and this is a UIC resource, so I just want to be clear, some of the links in here are UIC specific, but I think conceptually this information is fine. Some of the ideas, and we're going to talk about this around accessibility, accommodations, and including an inclusivity statement in your syllabus. So I do want to share this. We're not going to go through this specifically, but this way, if anybody does need to leave early, I want to make sure you had something to take with you as we kind of now tackle this a little bit more together. So I'm going to pause right here. Because I mean, I know we haven't gotten into the weeds in any of this yet, but I just want to know if there's any reactions, thoughts, questions that you might want to throw out at this point. Alex.
Well, thank you, Erin. That's very interesting. So I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about what does it mean student-centering language, or you will be speaking about it later?
I will be speaking about it. I think that's actually next.
Okay, then a quick question then. Is there any data on, do students even read that?
Do they even
Do they
read
the syllabus?
Yes, there actually is. And that is something I'm going to talk about at the very end. And I'll say, let me say a caveat to that. They won't read your syllabus if not incentivized or otherwise, I guess, kind of trained to do so. And just as kind of a primer to that, students don't encounter syllabi when they're in high school. This is not a document that is a normal part of their practice in their education. So when they come to college for the first time, and the syllabus and the learning management system and this whole kind of structure that we as college faculty sometimes take for granted because this is just sort of standard for us, this is not. And so one of the things I often emphasize is that if you are teaching, especially, first fall, freshmen, or at least first year students, no matter where you're at as part of the, sort of the teaching community on a campus, it is so important to be so intentional and proactive about encouraging students to read the syllabus, because then it becomes embedded in their practice throughout the next, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 6 years, right, that they're in college. And we kind of do a disservice if we take that for granted and don't sort of embed that, in the practice of the students, right? And I think kind of related to that, if we kind of get, and having taught, students throughout, their 4 years of college and into graduate school, different levels, this also has to be sort of something that's agreed upon across the institution, that this is important, and that we don't just have, whether it's a consistent format, or at least it's sort of agreed upon set of standards that students are getting from the syllabus, so that it is still a useful tool to students no matter what class they're taking, and that they aren't just seeing as like, oh, I've already seen this before, I read this before, like I'm not getting anything new or interesting or important out of the syllabus that I didn't get in the previous class, right? Like it has to be useful, and we have to be very intentional about that in the design of the syllabus. So Alex, so we'll talk a little bit more about that I saved that for the end, but if you don't get around, if you can't stay all the way to the end too, I will be sharing my slides with Par after this, so she can distribute them. So all of those materials and things will be available to you. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So I had a quick question for you, and you might go over this towards the end, but in our professional development, we were encouraged to maybe just have the bare bones on the syllabus, and then have the resources and everything on the canvas. And a common concern is that, the syllabus is a legal document. And as you said, we want to incentivize them reading the syllabus. So I'm just curious about what the recommendation would be in terms of what's on the syllabus and what would be streamlined onto the Canvas shell.
Sure. And did you say it's a legal document?
Well, it's a binding document, so
it's not. Let me address that, right? It is absolutely not. That does not stand up in the court of law. It's not a legal document, and it's not a contract, but it oftentimes has contractual language. And I want to be, I say that only because unfortunately we have had, sort of more litigious sort of situations that have come up, and at the end of the day, I actually do, and I don't know what the practice is at LA Mission College or across the, the colleges. So I want to be careful in what I'm saying here, but I do include a sort of a caveat statement at the end of my syllabi that says this is subject to change too. Because as an instructor, if things come up and you need to be flexible, the more you really turn this into a contract where you can't, this is sort of the antithesis then of what we learned from the pandemic, is the need to be flexible within reason, right? The need to sort of accommodate within reason, and that prevents us from doing so. So there's a balance here. So I really want to be careful about how I kind of say that. And right, that is a conversation that you have to have at the department level and kind of figure out what your guidelines are going to be. But I think you really have to, have a conversation. But you asked, I'm sorry, so I got caught up on the contractual piece, but the other piece was, the short. I will actually address that. So the take home is that's actually a complete misconception. The research that's been done primarily in psychology has debunked that idea, and that students actually, if there is incentive to read, they appreciate having a lengthier syllabus with the information there. However, the way I think we've really approached this is like, well, we have a learning management system. How do we leverage that so that we still have a reasonable syllabus with the information they need? It's not 2 pages, it might be 4 or 5 pages, right? But how do we balance that with the learning management system in which we can get the information students need when they need it? And this is really consistent with the way, especially Gen Z kind of thinks about and digests information. They're very much about like getting the information when they need it. So I think having a syllabus and treating it as a tool that students can go back to, and they have a reason to go back to. And there's actually some studies like when they do go back to it. And so if you want to think about what to include in a syllabus versus what to include in an LMS, there is research, which I'll share, which shows you what maybe are the important elements then to retain in a syllabus versus diverting to another space. I don't have an example of this, but I have a colleague in chemistry, who has the traditional kind of PDF version of a syllabus that they need to, submit to the department, and that sort of conforms to the departmental requirements to document their syllabus. But the one she shares with students, she uses Padlet. And it's very visual and interactive. And it's just, I don't know if you're familiar with Padlet, but it's just a tool that a lot of times you can use in classes for like in lieu of like Jamboard, for example, as a way to get feedback and things from students. But she uses it for her syllabus. And it's mobile friendly, it's interactive, and it's just more interesting basically for students to look at and engage with. So, there's no reason we have to use the same format that we've always used either. And that might be the spirit of kind of moving some of this material to an LMS. I know that's probably way longer response than what you expected, but we, just to say, we've thought a lot about this, and these questions have come up, and we try to, look at the literature and like, what have we learned about this, so that at least if we're making these decisions, we can do it, with some data to kind of inform what we're doing. So these are great questions. Thank you. All right. So let's talk about building an inclusive syllabus. Before we kind of dive into the nuts and bolts of that, I do want to talk a little bit about what it means and what I mean when I'm talking about an inclusive classroom. And so I often like to kind of just start off by making sure that we're on the same page when I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what I mean by those terms too. When I talk about diversity, I'm talking about, multiple identities, multiple perspectives, the lived experiences that students bring into the classroom. Some of these identities are visible, many of them are invisible. And so I think just kind of being aware of that in our teaching. When I'm talking about equity, I'm talking about the success of students and their equal success, regardless of their identity group, regardless of their demographic characteristics and background. And we often talk about this in terms of like achievement gaps, for example, grade gaps, disparities across different groups, and really trying to have differentiated instruction for various students to kind of lift them all up and level the playing field to make sure that we're all, at the same point. when I'm talking about inclusion or inclusivity, that's where I'm really talking about the classroom practices and the behaviors or the culture that occurs within the classroom. And it requires us to understand that, bias, both explicit and implicit bias, identity threat, racial trauma, all have a role and sort of play into that environment. And so by understanding these things, by doing, taking action to mitigate bias, to mitigate identity threat, that ultimately this will help result in equitable outcomes for our students. So that coming back to the equity piece here and leveling the playing field and closing those opportunity gaps. So given this, we in developing the workshops that this being one of actually many inclusive teaching workshops that I do, there's 5 general principles, and you'll see these in different spaces. Folks talk about this and kind of group things differently, kind of depending on their flavor, but a lot of these overlap in the sense of what we're trying to sort of describe as an inclusive classroom or inclusive teaching practices. So when I'm talking about inclusive teaching, I'm talking about access and equity, that courses are designed for universal access. And we think about accommodations, modifications, the scaffolding students need, the resources that they'll need to be successful, and even building in choice into their curriculum, so that they have some agency too in what they're doing, what they're learning, and how they're demonstrating their learning. We're also talking about intentionality and transparency. So I think we're just looking at having learning objectives where students understand what it is that what is going to be expected of them, what it is that they're going to be learning in the class. Being transparent about how they're going to be demonstrating their knowledge, how they're going to be earning grades in the class, and what it's going to take to basically earn whatever it is that they feel is important for their the next steps, I guess, in their curriculum or their sort of job preparation, whatever it is that they're in class for. We're talking about representation and ensuring that minoritized, marginalized students see themselves positively reflected in the curriculum and the activities that they're doing, and that they're given some agency to actually explore, history and the history of a discipline and the interpretation of data, the way it's used subsequently to make decisions, and just some of the more relevant impacts, that their field of study may have in the world. We're also talking about relationships. So building inclusive classrooms really ensures, that there's trust. There's trust between students. There's trust between the faculty and the student. And that incorporates learning community agreements and norms that everyone in the classroom agrees to abide by, including things like academic integrity, for example. And finally, reflection and feedback. And this I kind of like to summarize in thinking about this as a two-way street and a two-way exchange of information. So it's not just about students getting grades, students getting feedback on their assignments. It's also about the instructor getting feedback on how students are doing, and doing this often so that you can kind of monitor instruction, monitor the pace of instruction in ways that actually ensure that everybody is keeping up, moving past some of those threshold concepts, for example, together, and not falling behind in the work. So we're going to go through different components of the syllabus now that are really framed by these principles, and we'll sort of revisit this throughout the workshop, but just to kind of get us all on the same page here as well. So the last thing I'll just say, though, and we're not going to have time to go through these, but there are countless barriers to inclusion that are faced by students, particularly minoritized students in the STEM disciplines. And these barriers collectively, produce an enormous cognitive load on our students, and they bring this into the classroom. And then it is a barrier to their learning. It's a barrier to their motivation to try. And so some of the things where we get frustrated as instructors because our students aren't staying motivated, engaged, they aren't responding to emails, they aren't seeking out the help that we advise them to do, to just be cognizant of the fact that they're really wrapped up and enveloped by a lot of these things that we don't have a lot of control over, but what we can control is what we do to really help students overcome, went the wrong way, overcome these barriers. And so some of the things, broadly speaking, we can do is ensure that we're being explicit and transparent in valuing diversity in our syllabi, for example, that we are using our syllabi and the teaching methods to cultivate a sense of belonging and foster a growth mindset. That when we are talking about being empathetic and using student-centered language, that we're communicating care and empathy, even if we don't fully understand or relate to all of the experiences of our students, that we at least take time to reflect and bring in that sort of reflective experience of our own to build that care and empathy, to do what we can to understand bias, trauma, identity threat, and do what we can to mitigate that. Normalizing challenges and setbacks is so important, that students who are struggling and failing, in fact, know that this is just a normal, that they aren't an exception, that this is a normal part of the learning process, and that to make them feel more included and that this is a normalized experience can actually help facilitate their help-seeking behavior, for example. You know, I think we talked about systematizing access to resources. I think a lot of times that is done at the institutional level, you know, kind of consolidating and making it easy for students to find what they need. But tied to that, and what we can do as instructors is really destigmatizing the use of these resources, and again, kind of normalizing this experience for students. All right, so let's all now kind of bring this now into our syllabus. So we're going to start off by talking about how do we establish relationships with our students, you know, through the syllabus. And I think this comes through Alex now finally to address your question about student-centered language. So the syllabus tone, as some of you pointed out in the Jamboard activity, you know, the opportunity to use the syllabus to set the tone of the class, I think is a real important thing to highlight here. So this is the first thing, you know, ideally that students are reading. It's the introduction to the class. And so when you're considering the language you're using in the syllabus, there are sort of three ways that we can kind of think about this, in that we want the language to be welcoming. And this is this idea of communicating care, respect, civility, support. Importantly, demystifying, avoiding using some of the jargon of the discipline right out the gate, or if you have to kind of qualify that and ensure or assure the students that they will learn what this means, and it doesn't have to be sort of a scary word that they haven't seen before and somehow they feel like they're the only person who doesn't know what that word is. And validating, making sure that students genuinely believe and know that you believe that they can succeed at this. And this is more getting at sort of this growth mindset piece. So to give you some concrete examples, we'll do an exercise here in the chat again. And I do see the chat's been active. I haven't looked at that, but we'll have a moment here where we can pause, and so if there's some questions, we can try to address that.
Questions and also answers. So.
Oh, good. Okay, answer each other's. I like it. All right, so I have a couple of these here that I want to throw out. So this is just the instructor contact information, and I want you to take a look at these two examples, and just tell me, A or B, which feels more inclusive to you, in the spirit of what we were just talking about in terms of inclusive language and some of these other framings. Okay, so this one seems pretty non-controversial. folks are agreeing that that B here sounds a little more inclusive. Is there anything that sort of jumps out at you why this is more inclusive to you? Or this feels more inclusive to you? You think about this welcoming, validating framework that we talked about. I mean, one of the things that has come up, yep, it starts with I understand. Yep, understanding there might be issues and it's okay, right? So just because you're coming to my office hours, right, doesn't mean that you're automatically failing. Great. Yep, and empathy that everyone can make it. Questions and concerns. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I do want to say one thing that's come up before is that, you know, the second example is longer. And people who do have concerns about making the syllabus longer are like, well, can I still be concise about being and still be inclusive? So one of the exercises I did at a previous workshop is like, okay, well, how do we wordsmith this then to make it shorter? And one example was, please email me if you have any questions. I'd like to hear from you. So that's at least welcoming. It doesn't necessarily convey the validating piece to it, but it does at least still convey a welcoming tone. So there's some things that you can do to kind of tweak this a little bit. And I just want to qualify that, you know, you can do that to make it work. Hit me up if you have questions. I got you. That's right. That's right. All right. So here's another one. This is about describing class participation and the expectations there. So on the left here, everyone in the class, including the instructor, has a responsibility to create an environment in which we all can learn from each other. Everyone is expected to participate in class so that we can all benefit from the insights and experiences that each person brings. Versus B, students are expected to come prepared to actively participate in this course. This is the best way to engage in learning the material, and it makes the lectures more interesting. So which feels more inclusive, A or B? Lots of A's, a couple B's, okay. Any thoughts here? If you want to share why you feel one or the other is more inclusive, and that's fine. You can add them to the chat. That worked well last time. B gets to the point. That's true. It's concise. Including the instructor. So it kind of creates a we mentality that we're in this together. It's just not just on the student. Validating student knowledge. Yep. And that the students bring something and it's not just a one-way communication. I think that's kind of what that gets to. Any other thoughts? Yeah, these are all great. Yep, humanizes the professor. It shows that he or she makes mistakes just like the students. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's hard for some folks. I mean, I think to acknowledge sometimes that's hard, you know, to remember even just writing up on the board and I'm spelling things wrong, right? And you know, you get sort of paranoid about that. But I think the more we can humanize ourselves and really model and bring that process to students, right? We're helping them to with those transferable skills and how they can interact with the world as well. That's great. That's great. Okay, so I have one more for you. So this one's a little bit longer. So this is a course overview. Again, which feels more inclusive, and I'll go ahead and read it just because it's longer. So A here, this course provides a strong chemistry foundation reviewing important physical and chemical principles. Important topics include atomic structure based on quantum mechanics, blah, blah, blah. There was more to it, we shortened it. The course concludes with the structure and properties of inorganic, organic, and biological acids, bases, and salts. Throughout the course, biological and environmental samples are used to illustrate the central role chemistry plays in biology. Versus B here. The goal of this course is to provide you with a strong foundation in general chemistry. We will begin with an investigation of physical and chemical principles. Then we will move on to blah, blah, blah list of chemistry stuff. This course concludes with the structure and properties of inorganic, organic, and biological acids, bases, and salts. Please note that if these topics don't sound familiar, don't panic. This course is designed to help you understand the fundamentals of chemistry. Throughout the course, biological and environmental examples will be used to illustrate the central role chemistry plays in the world around us. Lots of B's there. Yep. So why B then? What makes this feel more inclusive? A is very cold and technical, but it gets to the point. So. The bold term there is kind of, or the bold sentence there is kind of called out on purpose. I don't think in the actual syllabus it was bolded out, but yeah, don't panic. So this is idea of validating, right? Validating that not everything may sound familiar, because in both cases, right, we didn't include all of it. It was the ... but lots of jargon and terminology and things talking about the topics. But this really validating that it's okay if you don't, we're going to learn this is what we're here for, and that it's normal, right? Normalizing that for students. Absolutely. Yep. And again, this idea of focusing on we, you'll notice we is used throughout. Yep. Friendly approach. Yep. Yeah. So these are just examples, and I point out, very potentially innocuous parts of your syllabus that you may not have even thought about, where you may be communicating tone to students one way or another. And so what are kind of the takeaways, right, that this idea of using student-centered language, some things that concretely you could do? And this is probably this top one here is probably the number one thing when it comes to writing policies, when it comes to writing your syllabus, is to just use second and first person pronouns when referring to yourself and to the students. So in this class, you will, I will, together we will, as opposed to a lot of times you'll see that's where that's more contractual language, like students are expected to, the instructor will do this. That sort of third person really kind of is sort of one step removed from the student experience. And so simply by changing, the pronouns, you can make a huge difference right there in terms of the tone and centering the syllabus on students. I think this is a little harder to do. It takes a little bit more time, but I think really looking at some of the policy language and rephrasing some of it in a more strengths-based manner. So for example, here, one way to convey this is for each day an assignment is late, I will deduct 10% of your grade. But instead, you might say, instead focusing on the positive and not necessarily the point deduction, is you'll receive full credit for the assignments when it's completed on time. And in instances where the assignment is submitted late, you'll receive partial credit up to 90% of the total points possible, as opposed to focusing on the deduction. It's like those positive point rubrics as opposed to a negative point rubrics. Kind of think about that. And there's even things like that we've really been promoting in the template that we use at UIC is looking at some of the headings and things for the sections of your syllabus. Instead of course policies, for example, calling that section how to be successful in the course, and following course policies, right, is going to lead to success, but it's just a different framing that students see off the bat. Alex.
Let me just pitch something in. I'm not sure my students will be able to comprehend that second way. I'm assuming many of them will find it misleading on the second and third thought. You know, they'll come to me, where's my 90%? And I say, it was up to 90%. And then I will have an uncomfortable conversation. So, any thoughts?
That's a really good question. And I have two thoughts on that. So I think you know, if you maybe then think about a combination of these two sentences, right, where you're still leading off with, you'll receive full grade if it's completed on time. For each day it's late, I'll deduct 10%. That some combination of that, Alex, I don't think is the end of the world. This is kind of an extreme that I appreciate, but I think leading with that strengths-based, you know, message is what's important. It's kind of like when you give feedback, like you want to give feedback and say something positive first before you hit somebody with the negative. It's kind of that same approach that you could think about. It's like, okay, hit them with something positive. But then the reality is like, here's what might happen, the consequences. And so I understand that. Another approach to this, which is what we'll talk about at the end, is if you really do have consistent concerns about that, one of the ways that you could encourage your students to read your syllabus is through a syllabus quiz that you give students at the beginning. And so there could be questions about this. So let's say this scenario happens, what does this mean? And you have students work through this and they kind of figure it out on their own. And that could be built into the assessment that you designed for students. So then you don't have the difficult conversation, right? You have them do the calculation and figure out, oh, right, I only get 85% of the points or something if this happens.
Yeah, well, I understand all of the points, and yeah, so this makes total sense. You try to avoid negative language. We try to put just neutral contract language, but the suggestion is that it can be, you know, it's pretty negative if you read it like that. We'll deduct your 10% of the grade, and you'd be surprised how many of my colleagues will say that's exactly what I want to say. I want to be firm, and you know, and we and that's, in the big scheme of things, in the longer I teach, you know, even though like we talk about inclusivity, it's not immediately clear to me, are we doing a great service by being too welcoming? I remember to this day, like when students were saying, my best experience was when I had this horrible teacher and I had to teach myself. And then I asked, like, what is my role as a teacher in general? So like in the previous slide, you were talking about, you know, like this, I've chosen the version B when like about the expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is that as I'm reading the longer paragraph, I get immediately stuck on the phrase that is, we have an obligation, including the instructor, obligation. That word completely turned me off right there on the spot. Why? Because I hear from my students, I'm teaching flipped classroom, right? And they push back. They say, we came here, we paid money so that you read us lecture, not us create. Like there's a certain expectation from the students. And I say like, okay, on one hand, I know why I would say that. And that's the best way, but like, where's that boundary where we push our vision, or we really, like the students come with expectations, and I have to respect that. I have a percentage of students who came just to listen to a lecture. How respectful should I be of that expectation?
So this is there's a lot of questions here, Alex. So I just want to say as a caveat, I may not do justice to all of your questions right now, but I'm certainly happy to stay after too, and we can talk about this more. So there's a couple things here. I would say, who has this worked for? We know historically that the way in which things were done, lecturing at students and basically just delivering content for them, has worked really well for certain populations, and that there are underserved, marginalized, disadvantaged groups of students who have been historically and systemically excluded from higher education. We see disproportionate exodus, right, of Black and Brown students leaving the STEM disciplines. This is the reality. So I guess my question is like, who's it working for? This is what I came here for. This works for me. Who's it working for? So
Just
that's
to
one,
clarify
like,
real
right?
quick, Just
Yeah.
to clarify real quick, this question I get from Latinx students mostly.
And that's what I say. So fair enough, but that's sort of like the overarching kind of question I have just for, that higher ed is addressing, right? Who has this worked for? The other piece of this is that students, there's a body of literature, right? What students prefer, what their preferences are for learning, what their perceptions are for what good teaching is not at all correlated with actual learning. And we see this over and over and over again, right? So I think it's really important, and this is a different workshop, Alex, I'll just tell you, I do this work, this is a different workshop, but showing students data, right? That productive struggle, that having students teach students, having near peers, and doing peer instruction, and really having them, with more agency in their learning, that they're going to learn more, they're going to remember it, they're going to be able to apply that to other, areas of their coursework, those transferable skills, not just memorizing for the moment, right, to get an A on that exam, but really learning and being able to take that learning with them. That requires them to struggle, that requires them to basically entertain these other teaching methods, that lecturing is the most ineffective way for them to learn and be able to accomplish that, right? So we have to show them. We have to show them the data. And there have been countless studies. So I do this. I talk to my students about this. One other strategy that I use to, again, another workshop, Alex, but feedback, doing a mid-semester survey with your students and kind of asking students what's working for you, and kind of talking about, because maybe you're doing group work, maybe you're doing peer instruction, maybe you're doing some lecturing, right? Maybe they're doing workbooks or whatever it may be. Most of the time, you get a mix of responses, right? Different strategies work for different students. What I typically do is I bring this data back to the students for a couple of reasons. One is I want to make sure they know that I'm listening to them, and that there may be some things that they could tell me that I could be doing differently and make some shifts mid-semester to make the experience better for all my students. But the other thing that I oftentimes then get to point out is like, I know group work, or I know this active learning strategy that I'm using doesn't work for everybody, but I want you to see that it's working for some of your peers. And the reason I do it, the reason I use this mixed methodology is because I need to make sure all of you learn the material. I need to make sure everyone succeeds in this class. And so I am teaching this so that you all succeed. And that can help with, again, with buy-in, and that might be the place then where you bring in the literature, right? The data, say, look, this is what the data shows. This is why I'm doing this. So there are ways, I think, to be really kind of intentional to address that student resistance, because they don't know what they don't know, right? They are not studying the literature. They have their preferences, and they've done really well potentially in high school, kind of doing it this way. But that's not really what's going to really help them succeed once they're, in the college and university system. So again, I mean, we can have a much longer conversation on this, but I hope I touched on most of some of your concerns.
Yes, thank you. You answered my question more or less. So,
okay.
But going back to that language, the suggested language of the positive up to 90%, I would say tread carefully, because they will come to you 3 days before the final, when it's too late to do anything.
Are you talking come to you 3 days, but for what?
Before the final exam, and argue about where's my 90%.
Right. Yeah.
But, okay, thank you so much. Yeah,
okay. All right. This is good though, because this is in reality, like, this is what you're encountering on a day-to-day basis. So please interrupt me and ask questions like this, because it's so important, I think, for us to kind of grapple with some of this, because otherwise you're going to leave the workshop and be like, yeah, that's a great idea, but I can't make sense of this in terms of what I'm doing and what I'm encountering with students. So I appreciate that. All right. So if we could pause here for a few minutes, and I hope you all have access to or brought your syllabi, maybe for the class you're teaching this semester, or I don't know if you're in semester or quarter systems, but this term, or maybe one that you're planning to teach next term. And just take a look, skim through, pick a short section to read, and really kind of self-evaluate, given what we've talked about, to really ascertain whether or not the language you're using is these three pieces: welcoming, demystifying, and validating. Where could the syllabus language potentially be improved? Is the language that you're using student-centered? So this first person, second person pronoun piece, for example. So we don't have time, I think, for you to actually rewrite that section of your syllabus today. But just to kind of annotate, highlight, where could we come back to this? And I want to invite you to, turn off your cameras here for the next few minutes. So I can give you a chance to do this, and then we'll come back. I have it's 1:05 here. So it's 11:05. Let's come back at 11:10. After you have a chance to kind of look at things. So I want to make sure that you have a chance to actually do something with your own syllabi. So I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right, so we're going to move on here, talk a little bit more about that. Going back to our inclusive teaching principles here, I want to talk a little bit about strategies in your syllabus you can incorporate to promote access and equity. So just to kind of come back, this was that first principle there. So one of the things I usually like to ensure that we're differentiating here when we're talking about access is differentiating between accessibility and accommodation. And this is definitely something I think that has gained a lot more visibility in conversations in the teaching community post-pandemic than, unfortunately, I think it had before the pandemic and the move to remote instruction. But when I'm talking about accessibility, I mean that these are the things that we're doing that or what we should expect for us to really kind of be ready for students coming into our classroom, any of our students, without really requiring students to ask or having to plan ahead to make accommodations. And so these are things that we're doing to really benefit all students, not just those who may have a disability. Versus accommodation is that adaptation piece, where things that aren't anticipated, where you can't standardize things in the curriculum. These are things that have to be tailored for individuals who come to us. And it could be things like a religious observance. It could be things like technology needs or gaps in technology, access that students may have, COVID, other health related issues, et cetera. So there are ways in our syllabus that we can sort of promote this idea of accessibility, and that's through, more flexible policies and really kind of acknowledging the lived experiences of our students, that they may be different from our own and they're different from one another. So things like offering grace periods for a limited number of assignments and not necessarily requiring students to provide an explanation for this. I know that this might be something that's a little easier to do with older students or those who are, more or further along, I guess, in their academic progress. Students who are coming in their first year, they're kind of acclimating to college, and some of that flexibility can come with some, sometimes we need some guardrails, some parameters on that. But I certainly do this in when I'm teaching my graduate students, is I give them 2 absences, for example, and I'm like, I don't care what your reason is, doesn't matter to me. Life happens, life comes up. But this is the process that I put in place for folks who miss class. This is what we do for everybody. And so it's the approach that I'm using. I don't need a doctor's note. I don't care. But just to say that that's one kind of way to think about this. Replacing high stakes assessments with more frequent lower stakes assessments. So we heard a lot about this, especially with some of the real concerns folks had about online examinations and some of the issues with that. Dropping the lowest score at the end of the term, you know, rather than trying to chase people around, trying to figure out how to do makeup exams and things like that. For online courses, if you teach those, acknowledging and providing upfront and reasonable accommodations for difficulties primarily due to sort of some of the technology hurdles that we saw students have. Certainly, I think within the larger, you know, landscape of educational technology, Canvas is certainly amenable to this, is really thinking about when we're using technology in the class that it's mobile friendly. And I think realizing not every student has a laptop, and we saw this, right? Not every student may be able to get to campus to use the campus computer facilities. And so a lot of designers and things too of the applications and things now are really thinking about, well, how are students using their phone? You know, their smart device, because most of our students have that. I feel like now they're actually coming out of the womb with it. I probably shouldn't say that, but I really do feel like these phones are really part of almost an appendage now for many of us, myself included. But I think some of that, at least from the technical standpoint, is being addressed by really thinking about having mobile friendly applications and the work and things that can be done through a phone as opposed to relying exclusively on a computer. And I know that, especially our community college faculty, I think we've learned a lot of from our community college faculty, really in thinking about these financial pieces. Whether it's with open educational resource, using text, being mindful of the financial costs and finding different ways that students can access those materials and things through different formats, et cetera, have been really, really helpful. And I think doing some homework ahead of time to figure out what that might be is really helpful in creating a more accessible learning environment. I think within the syllabus itself is being explicit and including an accessibility statement. So I asked BAMDAD, who shared with me, I think, some of the information, which is this bottom part here, that actually is coming out of LA Mission College and the Disability Resource Center there. I did take a little liberty here and made sure that all of it was written in first or second person first and second person pronouns. There was some third person mixed in with the first and second person, so I tried to make it consistent. So this is something you may have heard before, but I think, as we were talking about before, what I added here was just this sort of, before you kind of got into that policy language, an introduction to just say, again, this positive framing to this. LA Mission College is committed to the full exclusion and participation of people with disabilities in all aspects of college life. So if you face or anticipate disability-related barriers while you're here, please connect with this resource on campus. Those who do have verified, disabilities, here is the process. This is what needs to happen, and making sure that all comes across. And like I said, first, second person pronoun language, just to kind of warm up that tone to the way you're delivering the information. So the information is still there. It's just framing it and helping, students feel less reluctant to come to you with their disability, or to seek those resources out, and kind of normalizing that experience for students. I also adopted, this is a inclusivity statement that we have at UIC, and I basically just swapped in LA Mission College. I'm not aware that BAMDAD couldn't find anything. I think that LA Mission College had a standard inclusivity statement, but this is another statement to include in your syllabus, or something like this, just to really, again, signal to students that this is important, that you care, and that this is something that you think about. Again, it's a signal to student. There's a lot of action that has to, kind of come with this, but this is a place to start. And we are just talking about the syllabus here. So this is one idea. LA Mission College values diversity and inclusion regardless of age, disability, ethnicity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, geographic background, religion, political ideology, language, or culture. We expect all members of this class to contribute to a respectful, welcoming, and inclusive environment for every other member of our class. There are aspects of the instruction or design of this course that result in barriers to inclusion, engagement, accurate assessment, or achievement. Please notify me as soon as possible. So this is kind of all a lot to take in, but this is something that's sort of been standardized, at least in our first year direct admit courses. So you can think about that. Did you put something in there? An inclusion affirmation? Okay, but it's too long for a syllabus.
Just way too long.
Yeah, but this could be something, as a department, as a unit within, your institutions, that you put together something that, is included in all of the syllabi for your courses. This could be an exercise in really kind of talking about what's important, what's valuable to all of you, and that you want to communicate to students, and maybe starting there with your inclusion statement or inclusion affirmation statement as a place. Okay, so because I'm mindful of the time here, so we're not gonna actually pause for the activity, but I do want to give you these questions as a prompt for you to look at your syllabi and think through some of this. So does your syllabus communicate that diversity is valued? Is there an accessibility statement or an inclusion statement? In the policy language, does it really think about students who have difficulties either with attending class, meeting deadlines, kind of accounting for some of these unexpected things, not just for the students who have documented accommodations, but for students like life happens, you get sick, you get RSV, you get COVID, whatever it might be. I think influenza A was flying around this fall. And really kind of thinking about that. And then again, kind of annotating your syllabus to see where you can kind of do a little bit of research, maybe work with your colleagues to make some adaptations. All right, we had originally planned a 15-minute break. We don't have we don't have time for that. I really want to make sure that we get to the piece at the end. So I'm gonna get through some of these remaining slides rather quickly, because I want to talk about these questions that came up at the beginning, and some of these practical things that you're thinking about with respect to the syllabus. But to kind of think about creating intentionality and transparency, this is the second factor here. Think about your learning goals and how you have described those in your syllabus, and ensure that where you may have these broader, shorter learning objectives in your syllabus, are you looking at your lectures, are you looking at your homework assignments and lab assignments, and ensuring that you're really kind of parsing those out into measurable learning objectives that tie back to and map, when we think about curriculum mapping, map to what you are communicating in your syllabus, and being really intentional about this. Also being, showing students and being really transparent about how they should learn, use the learning objectives. They're not just there for you to say, you've written learning objectives, like, how are these things useful? One is to tell students preemptively, review them before coming to lecture, pay attention to these before you're reading the textbook material for the first time. Use them as a study guide, because if they're written as learning objectives should be, with a verb and then the expectation for what the students are supposed to do and then be evaluated on, then they should be able to read those learning objectives and be able to practice and prepare for the exam if the exam is aligned with what they're expected to do. Promoting a growth mindset with your students is important. And I won't go through this in detail, but just to say that a lot of the work that has been done in this field has really been in thinking about students' response to setbacks, challenges, and other academic barriers. And whatever we can do as an instructor to really convey in a genuine manner that students can develop the skills and knowledge that they need to be successful in your class and in that major. It just takes time. There's a rap out there called The Power of Yet. You know, I am not very good at chemistry yet. And so what can we do to actually empower students and help students become better? What resources can we use, and really instilling that? Ways that we can even incorporate into our assessments, valuing hard work and effort. Like, are we giving students points for practicing and doing things that lead up to these higher stakes assessments that they might be taking? I think that what's also important is that faculty realize that some of the more recent research has been looking at instructor mindset, and instructor mindset matters too. Basically, this was one of the first studies that was done a couple of years ago, or that was published a couple of years ago, that really was pretty impactful, and that it was 150 different faculty involving 15,000 or more students. And what they did is the faculty took a survey, and depending on how they answered certain questions, they could be categorized along that continuum as having more of a fixed versus a growth mindset. And so depending on kind of which bucket they fell in, they started looking at student grade outcomes. And they basically saw that there was a bigger equity gap in courses in which the instructor was more likely to have a fixed versus a growth mindset between ethnically diverse students. It was almost twice as big for faculty who were associated with having a fixed mindset. So it's just to say that mindset matters, not just for students, but it also matters for students as well. And so just as a way, though, that you can incorporate this concretely into your syllabus is, and some of you talked about this, like setting expectations and creating a roadmap for student success. And so I bolded these terms in this part of the syllabus that kind of fostered this. So nearly every student will be challenged by the course material at every point in the term. So again, normalizing setbacks, normalizing challenges for students. It doesn't mean that the material isn't hard, but everybody experiences this at some point with different parts of the material. Students who grow their abilities the most make use of my office hours. We call them drop-in hours. That's why that's in parentheses, and are quick to reach out when they find themselves struggling. So again, normalizing that, and also inviting them, with concrete strategies. Come to my office hours. This is what successful students do. I think one of the things I just wanted to say this, that we kind of try to avoid are some of these statements, which actually just kind of, they just don't come across as being particularly authentic. You should have a growth mindset. Well, what does that mean concretely? How's that kind of help a student in terms of figuring out how to navigate the challenges they're having? Success is merely a matter of effort. Well, that's not exactly true. It helps. Practice makes better. But the class is designed to be easy. That's also a bad one. Like, I think, and sometimes we do things like, all students do this, and kind of making these generalizations and things like that can really come across as disingenuous. So I think things that you can do even subtly that convey that you genuinely believe, that students with effort and that it's concretely built into the way that you're structuring the class, that reflects that authenticity. So again, just to say, looking at your syllabus, where is it already attuned to this? Highlight those sections. Where is it that you can maybe improve some of this? That's really weird. I don't know why that's doing that. Where is it that you could improve and maybe add some things to facilitate a growth mindset? How are you normalizing challenges? How are you connecting students to resources, and kind of making note of this? The last piece here is I really wanted to talk about how to embrace representation in the syllabus, and really helping the minoritized students see themselves in the syllabus. So since this is a primarily STEM workshop. This is something that came from a paper published last year in the Journal of Chemical Education. And these are some things, some strategies and things that folks in chemistry have been trying to use. Like, how do I do it? How do you actually do this in a chemistry or a math course or statistics course? Like, how do I do this? Well, some things you could think about is really reflecting on, what scientists, what mathematicians, what statisticians are you highlighting? Are you really making an effort to highlight those folks from different cultures and backgrounds who have made a contribution to the field? And it could be through images, it could be through quotes, it could be through literature that has been published. This could also include sharing your own background experiences, or those maybe of prior students who had been in the course who may have commented on their experience. Sharing the history of the discipline. Many of the historical kind of achievements have come through this European and North American male lens, but there are a lot of global influences, international influences to scientific endeavors that we can acknowledge and incorporate into our work. I think this idea of encouraging this notion of doing group work and emphasizing that success in science in particular is often done through teams. The single author paper is a thing of the 60s and 70s. I don't know that it's so rarely done now, right? That their collaboration is actually incentivized. It's important. It's critical to the success, in academia alone. So I think that dispelling myths that things are done in isolation is really helpful. Supporting student voices and their perspectives. Like I said, considering quotes from your own students, past students, highlighting what they were passionate about. That all of these things can help celebrate inclusion in your classroom. These are a couple of examples from a community college in which they have included things, images and things in their syllabus of students from others, international scientists and things who are important to the discipline. And again, you're not seeing sort of a boring syllabus here, right? Attending to some imagery and things too to make this, interesting for students to look at. But this is just kind of to give you some examples of what that might look like. And then I also want to share some resources with you. I think one of the ones I really like is from DePaul University, Diversifying the Curriculum. And I won't go through this in detail, but it is based on a book that was published a few years ago. But this is the piece reflecting on your course content. And it just gives you some questions to kind of think about, what scholars, what researchers make up my discipline, the canon, the one that's historically, traditionally taught. What are their social identities? Has this evolved over time? If not, why not? What's preventing, others from being part of the discipline? Why isn't there more diversity in the canon or in the scholars and researchers who are part of this? What perspectives am I prioritizing? When I'm actually selecting things, where am I missing perspectives that might reflect the lived experiences of my students? And importantly, how can diversity change or enhance what it is that I'm teaching? I think that this is one of those pieces that sometimes and our students, Gen Z in particular, is getting much more vocal about really challenging this and asking questions in class, like the why. And we're not ready for it. We're not ready to answer the why. We're kind of really locked in step with what's been done, what's always been done. And this is an opportunity for us to kind of step back as instructors and really think about, well, what's missing? Where are there opportunities to really kind of have a conversation and actually bring my students into this and think about this almost from a social justice standpoint? Like why is the question? Why hasn't this changed? And where are there opportunities, I think, for students to try to see themselves in this field, in this work going forward? And how can I facilitate that? All right, that's one of my faves. So again, just to kind of leave you with some concrete questions by which to look at your syllabus is, think about, what does my course communicate about who the main players are in my field that I'm teaching? Does it reflect the actual diversity in the field? Does it reflect tradition? What was the social, political, or historical context in which this knowledge was produced? How did this shape my own assumptions or the norms that are in the field? What do students need to learn and practice in order to be successful in this field? What are some of the real world applications? So again, for students to be able to understand that relevance piece, how do I make this relevant despite sort of the historical implications? How do I make this relevant to my students? How can they use this outside of my classroom and, in the field or in their lives in general? So those are just some things, and some of this can be communicated when you're describing your course. What are you going to learn about this course? Why does it matter? And bringing that, I think, critical reflection, into your syllabus and making it relevant to students. All right, so this was like kind of I wanted to get to this piece because I know this is where some of the questions were at the beginning. These are sort of those additional syllabus considerations. But let me pause. Alex, you have a question? Is there a website dedicated? Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, you don't have to answer right now because I know like we're strapped for time. I just so you can answer it later if you want.
Okay. Is there a website dedicated to these resources? There is. I'll put it up at the end. So USC, actually, if I go back to it, maybe I can grab it quickly. This equity-minded syllabus review toolkit, that they have a group at USC who's been doing this. And I'll pull that and put that in the chat here in a second. All right. So how long can the syllabus be? So this question came up at the beginning, right? Where there's a lot of, I think, effort, it sounds like, to shorten the syllabus and try to move some of the content to the LMS or other places where students can access that information. So there was a study that was done in 2015 that looked at student perceptions of syllabus length. And they gave them syllabi of different lengths. I think the shortest one they looked at was 6 pages, and the longest were between 9 and 15 pages long. So 2/3 of the students preferred the longer syllabus, and mainly attributed this to the fact that all of the assignment policy details were included. So there was a lot of information there that really helped them understand the expectations of the course, compared to the other third, which reported preferring the shorter syllabus. And kind of looking at the 9-page syllabus, so the one kind of in between, students reported that they thought the instructor was more caring and helpful, and kind of taking the time to attend to that, as we talked about earlier, that language that was used, and that students were more willing to seek help from the instructor because they felt like it was more welcoming, and the instructor itself, they were making basically through the syllabus, the instructor was making an impression on the students. Here, thinking about, well, I don't want to necessarily have a 9-page syllabus, but how can I leverage some of the other tools that I have maybe to distribute this information? So this study, which is a little bit older, looked at how students actually use the syllabus. So this may help you kind of focus on what you should include in the syllabus, maybe from what you need to think about more in the know, like when they need it. So they looked for things like the dates of tests and quizzes. So the schedule was important. They looked at grading policies. They wanted to know the expectations for what they needed to do and how they needed to demonstrate their learning. They looked at the course goals and the learning objectives, and they looked at statements supporting help-seeking behavior. Where is it that I was going to get these resources? Things that they looked at when they needed it. So they might look to see if a quiz was scheduled that same day. So that might be something that would be good to put in an announcement right through the LMS, is reminders of when those kinds of assessments are coming up. To preview the topic of the day's class. So if there were pre-class assignments or readings or videos and things that students needed to do, that might be something you want to send out as an announcement. Those kinds of details where it would be sufficient to kind of put the topic in the syllabus, but the details of what they were doing online to find out what they, and so related to that, to find out what they should read, to determine what homework had been assigned. So again, leaving the details of the homework out of the syllabus, but including that information in more of an announcement, something like that. You know, and you saw an example a few slides ago of a community college faculty member who definitely was taking some artistic license, right, with the visual elements of the syllabus. There was actually I think this was from, was this a communications, what was it? Communications composition class, but the instructor turned their syllabus into essentially a comic. It looked like a comic book for students. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with this to make your syllabus visually compelling for students. Like I said, I have a faculty member who used what do you call it? Padlet to display things. The one thing that I would say, though, with this and with any kind of artistic license that you take, I think Alex, you put in there, yeah, like the fair use piece to make sure that you're attending to copyright kind of considerations. But I think honestly, where I think is most important is to think about the accessibility of the content. I know increasingly there are policies, if not laws, on digital accessibility. And so if you have imagery and you have content laid out and you haven't attended to whether or not that content is available through a screen reader, that it's problematic. So you may have made it interesting, but then now you're going to need you've created a situation where an accommodation might be needed for someone who's visually impaired and can't use a screen reader. So you do need to be conscious of the fact that if you're doing these things, they need to align with the accessibility policy standards and laws of your institution, your state, etc. Make it readily available, posting it on your course, emailing it to students. I know we're not printing things anymore, and that's okay, but using a QR code so students have their cell phones, mobile phones in class, they can scan the QR code and bring that syllabus up on their phone in class right there, no excuses, right? So that's another way to kind of consider bringing that into the classroom, especially if you're revisiting it, which is this next point here. Always come back to it. Make sure it's a tool, something that you send students to throughout this semester, throughout the term, to make sure that they see that content is something you're using and thinking about. Try a syllabus quiz or a scavenger hunt. So these are a little bit different. A scavenger hunt is more of a group activity. A syllabus quiz can be an individual activity. But to really get students to look through the syllabus and identify those critical elements that basically, if you've been teaching a class, it's the questions that students routinely ask you all the time, and they just come back over and over again, the same questions. Those are a really good place to start as far as syllabus quiz or scavenger hunt. You can hide an Easter egg. And so put a picture of a kitten here. If you put a line in your syllabus that says, email, me a picture of your favorite pet. That way, the students have read the syllabus and they get X number of participation points, for doing so, kind of thing. And there are, a variety of other ideas and things that you could consider. But just so that these recommendations come from, research that has been done is there was a study that looked at syllabus design to see what the impacts of that were. And so they compared what they called a contractual versus a more engaging syllabus. And I think, one of the main takeaways from this is that there was a huge impression that the syllabus made on students with respect to what they then assumed about the instructor. And so depending on whether or not that syllabus was written with contractual versus engaging language, the students assumed that person might be more approachable or personable. whether or not they were an effective communicator, they were enthusiastic for their subject, whether they were flexible or open-minded. This is tying to that growth mindset piece, et cetera. So I know sometimes that we don't think about this, but it can, this is the first impression that you want to set with your students about yourselves too, that this can actually convey a lot to the students that way. These are just some examples. Again, I'll share this so you have this, but some of the questions and things that folks have come up with that you can include in a syllabus quiz or a scavenger hunt, just so you have some examples of that. And I think just to kind of end here, I hope that you'll kind of think about, helping your students get the most out of your syllabus. And so I just wanted to know for a last chat kind of activity here. Let's see here, options A through E. After today, what you might think about doing. So A, I plan to go over my syllabus on the first day of class. B, I will assign a short online assignment, directing students to the key points in the syllabus and addressing some of the common questions that I might always get in the first few weeks of class. C, organizing a scavenger hunt for the first lecture that you have, or maybe it's a quiz. D, I plan to regularly refer to students to the syllabus, or E, I have other plans. All of these things. Great. All right. Well, so for the remaining time, I'm not going anywhere. I know we're booked, I think, together until noon. So I wanted to make sure we had some time, to ask questions, to talk a little bit more. But before you all leave, I do want to navigate you one more time to the Jamboard, because this way, if we don't have time to answer everybody's questions, if you go back to the Jamboard, you go to the second frame here. The question here is, what were your biggest challenges, or what do you anticipate your biggest challenges being in updating your syllabus based on what we talked about today? And what further questions or concerns do you have?
Erin, you may want to leave the post the link again for those who joined us after you posted the link.
Yeah, I think I thought I just posted it. I did not paste it. I copied it, but I didn't paste it. Thank you. So just as a reminder, you can come over here and grab a sticky note. You can type in your response, click save. And then you can move your sticky note around. You can increase or decrease the size. Yep. Maintaining tone, make sure you cover everything that needs to be covered. So I'm asking for, some of the biggest challenges you might anticipate, or just any questions you may still have. The time, yeah, taking the time. A checklist would be great. So that's where I'll put this resource in the chat again. Where did it go? Well, here, I'll move. We'll do it this way. So I put this resource up before. I'll let me share this link again. This is a quick guide, which you could also think of as a checklist. Kind of going through and giving you some ideas and things to kind of work through different sections of your syllabus, and thinking about some of the things that you can do to make it more inclusive. So, check. Well, so with respect to the time piece, I do want to say, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about more of the syllabus language and tone piece, you know, I think as a first step, just being kind of mindful of using first and second person pronouns. You know, I will do this, we will do this, you will do this kind of thing, is an easy kind of low hanging fruit just to kind of go through and sort of without changing anything else, really just kind of changing the framing and making it sound less contractual and more of a conversation with your students. That would, you know, in terms of thinking about your time, that would be something to just start with. Shouldn't take too long, but that would be something that could really be helpful. Some of the items were added to the, oh, thank you. Okay, so over here. Need help of a psychologist to work on the language of the syllabus should probably be supported by my university. Well, maybe we can tackle that a little bit if whoever wrote that has some time. Have no idea how to link math cultural identities of my students. We can talk about that. I'm not sure what else of these. Okay. I don't know if you want, I don't know if I can move these over here. I can. Yes. There we go. Let's have an introduction. Okay.